Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 25 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent writing crime fiction inspired by actual FBI cases. This is the second half of a two-part episode with former FBI agent Terry Hake. Terry continues his account of working undercover as a crooked defense attorney in the largest public corruption investigation in America. When the investigation, codename Operation Greylord, was initiated, Terry was a young assistant state's attorney fed up with the corruption in the Cook County, Illinois court system. During the investigation, he was hired as an FBI employee, first as a project development specialist and then as a special agent. Terry wore a wire for 3.5 years, fully aware that he could have been jeopardizing his reputation and his law career by doing so. At the conclusion of the undercover operation, Terry testified in 23 trials over a 10-year period, and 83 judges, lawyers, court personnel, and police officers were convicted for accepting bribes to fix court cases. Also in this episode, Terry explains to us why, after being employed for only 7 years with the FBI, he resigned and instead continued his 23-year career in law enforcement at several other non-bureau agencies. Before we get to that interview, I just want to give a shout out to the teachers and educators that I met early last week. I was invited to be a presenter at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia's Economic Education and Financial Literacy Program. I spoke to the educators and teachers about scams and schemes and corruption. We had a discussion about ethics, and the suggestion was that maybe ethics should be taught in school. So hello, educators and teachers. It was fabulous meeting you. Please keep in touch. This is the July 9th episode, and I'm actually recording this intro a few days early. If you're listening to it on Saturday, please note that I am in New York City at Thriller Fest 2016. For those of you who don't know, Thriller Fest is one of the largest thriller, mystery writers, crime writers conferences in the country, in the world. Best-selling authors, brand new authors, wannabe authors will all be in attendance. It's my 5th year, and I know this year is going to be just as much fun as all the others. It's a great opportunity to learn the craft, find out what's new in the industry, and just meet lots of people who share the same interest as I do, writing crime fiction. Perfect timing because my next crime fiction newsletter is due at the end of the month, so that newsletter will be full of photos and stories about what I learned at Thriller Fest 2016. One of the highlights for me will be having the opportunity to meet and hear from Gillian Flynn. She's the author of Gone Girl. She writes the kind of books I love to read about dark, flawed characters. Can't wait to meet her. We'll talk more about Thriller Fest after we finish our interview with Terry Hake. So here's the show. Hi, everyone. I want to reintroduce you to Terry Hake. As you recall, Terry was with us last week, and he started talking to us about Operation Greylord. This is part 2. Terry, it's good to have you back.
Jerry, thank you for having me back.
I don't know if you recall where we were, because I'd like to just start right up.
Well, we had talked last week about how I became an FBI employee in February of 1981. As we discussed, I was sworn in as an FBI employee. I wasn't an agent at the time. I was an undercover lawyer working for them, still on Operation Greylord. And my assignment then as an FBI employee was to work undercover as a lawyer, bribing judges throughout Cook County, Illinois. For the first 9 months of the case, I was a cooperating witness with the FBI. I was an assistant state's attorney, a prosecutor in drug court. I I cooperated with them, working undercover, wearing a recorder, developing evidence of attorneys bribing the judge in his chambers in narcotics court.
All right, so where are we now? What happens after that?
So the FBI makes me an employee. My title was Project Development Specialist. Of course, everything in the government, you have to have a job title, and they decided being a Project Development Specialist didn't say much about what I was actually doing, working undercover as a lawyer. So my job then was to represent criminal defendants to pay bribes to judges in Cook County to get these criminal defendants off. However, the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office decided that, we really don't want to fix the cases of real criminal defendants. We might be getting someone off by paying a bribe, and that criminal defendant could go out and commit more horrendous crimes, perhaps even murder. We, the government, don't want to do that. So the Department of Justice and the U.S. Attorney's Office and the FBI decided that they would stage crimes. So we brought FBI agents in from throughout the country to pose as criminals and get arrested. We brought FBI agents in to be victims of crimes. And then it was my job and the other undercover attorney's job, David Reese, to get these undercover FBI agents off by paying a bribe.
And did it work every time?
Well, it didn't work every time. Good question. Because initially they went out and staged drunken driving cases. And we felt too we had to fool the Chicago Police Department because we didn't feel we could trust the police because many officers were involved in this corruption in the court system.
Right, and you had no idea of, which ones.
Exactly. So they started staging drunken driving cases. They'd have agents drive down Lakeshore Drive in Chicago at 80 miles an hour. They would pour Jack Daniels over their clothing and throw the bottle on the floor of the car. And we'd hope they'd get arrested for drunk driving. But it didn't always work out because on one occasion, the police officer solicited the undercover FBI agent for a bribe. Another time, the officer took the agent's keys to the vehicle and threw them in the park so he wouldn't drive. And even on shoplifting cases, we'd have agents shoplift in a department store and they'd walk out with the merchandise. They wouldn't get stopped. So we weren't initially successful with our cases. Eventually, on the shoplifting cases, we'd have a good citizen undercover FBI agent tell a store clerk or whatever, hey, that guy just put some candlesticks under his coat and he's headed towards the door. And so then we started having a 100% success rate on our shoplifting cases. But drunken drivings were always touch and go. But as time went on, we became quite sophisticated at staging these crimes. So David Reese and I could fix these cases. We eventually did illegal gun cases. We did auto thefts. We did robberies on the street, aggravated batteries. We became quite adept at staging these crimes. And as I mentioned, we brought in FBI agents from throughout the country to pose as these criminals.
Now, did any case, for some reason, continue into the court system much further than you wanted it to go?
No.
I mean,
no.
So every single time you were able to bribe somebody to either dismiss the case or rule in your favor?
I'd say 90% of the time we were successful with fixing the case. If a case wasn't going well, let's say we introduced a case in front of a certain judge, and then all of a sudden that judge gets transferred to another courtroom. Then we'd have the FBI agent, the undercover FBI agent, bond forfeit his bond, and a warrant would be issued for that person. So that way we still had the case out there. So if another corrupt judge was eventually transferred into that particular courtroom, where the warrant was pending, we could have the agent surrender himself, and we'd start up the case with the second judge.
Oh, and that's kind of sad too, because you did that knowing that in most cases a bench warrant
it'd never be executed.
Yeah, that's kind of sad. It happens in Philadelphia too. We have a whole huge backload of bench warrants, and people who never made it to court.
Right. But one time a judge I offered him a bribe and he exploded at me. So we did have that happen on one occasion.
One out of how many?
One out of probably 30. And it wasn't like he wasn't fixing the case for me either. What had happened was I was working through these bagmen, and the system was set up to work through these bagmen who insulated the judge. And these two bagmen were Chicago police officers, identical twin brothers who worked down in Chicago traffic court. Their job was to check policemen in who were coming in to testify in traffic court. So I set up the fix with these two twin brothers, and they said, "Oh, yeah, you can go bribe Judge Ellis, no problem. He's sitting down at this other courthouse at 13th and Michigan." So the way we developed evidence on the judges was, we didn't want to keep racking up bagmen. We wanted the judges. So they set the fix up for me with Judge Ellis, whom I had never met before. And then I'd get to the courthouse real early in the morning and walk into the chambers, and I'd introduce myself to Judge Ellis. In this case, I said, "Judge, my name's Terry Hake. I believe you may have heard from the Trunzo brothers about my case." "Oh, yeah, the twins. They called me. Yeah, the twins." I said, "Judge, I'm going to have to try this case." "What do you mean? Why? You don't want to try this case. Take some expungable supervision so that your client won't have a record." And I said something like, "Well, my client's an accountant. He doesn't want to lose his CPA license. I'm going to have to try this case." "Oh, okay." I said, "Judge, if I can give you a little bit more, I'm happy to." And as soon as I said, "If I can give you a little bit more," he exploded at me. He goes, "What do you mean? No one's talking about money here. We're not talking about money. If you want to buy those guys dinner, that's fine, but we're not talking about money here." I said, Judge, I'm sorry." So we kind of learned a little bit of a lesson there. I had never met him before. And then I walked in on him for the first time, and he didn't know me from Adam. So after that, we'd do a couple cases through a bagman with a judge. He'd get to know you. Then maybe on the third fix, I'd walk in there and have a similar conversation. But that was one of the scarier moments for me in Greylord, when I had to go face the two Chicago policemen, the Trunzo brothers, to explain why Ellis exploded at me. And when I went down to see them at traffic court about an hour after it happened, they had already heard about it. The judge had called them. And he said, and they told me, "You don't go in there and talk to a judge. If we tell you to go down there and it's all set, it's all set. Don't go in there and talk to him." Yeah, you're right. So that's the one time out of about 30 that it didn't work. But there's no doubt in my mind that he took the phone call and was going to fix the case.
Oh, so see, I was thinking when you said that one time that it didn't work, it's because you had an honest judge.
No, our predication on him, our intelligence indicated that he took bribes as a judge and had paid him out when he was a criminal defense attorney.
And that's a good point to make as far as predication. Could you talk a little bit more about that so the listeners could understand who you're approaching and why you're approaching them?
It being a public corruption case, we had to have very good indication that these judges, these public officials, were taking bribes. The Department of Justice in Washington wanted that. And it was called predication. It was intelligence that these people were engaged in bribe activity. And actually, as it turned out, it was very simple to get because the system was so corrupt. We might get it from another lawyer we'd been talking to about a judge. He might tell us, well, yeah, I fixed a case with him 3 weeks ago. Or we might get it from some of these bagmen we were dealing with. For example, with one judge, I had a case. I had fixed a case with this bagman. He was a court clerk named Harold Kahn. And Harold tells me, I'm fixing a case with Judge Devine, and after I pay Harold to fix this drunken driving case, he tells me, oh, yeah, I'm working in this other judge's courtroom today, Judge Lawn. And, we used to do the same thing with Judge Lawn that I'm doing with you here today when Judge Lawn was a lawyer. So it was pretty simple to get this predication. Or I might even say to a clerk like Harold Kahn, I'd say, Harold, I have a case in front of Judge Murphy at Belmont and Western. Can we pay him? Sure, no problem. And, of course, we had a criminal case on Harold, so the predication coming from his mouth was pretty darn good stuff. So, Jerry, you might ask, well, your predication was good. You ended up charging 103 individuals in this case. How many used the defense of entrapment when they eventually went to trial?
Right.
And the answer was 0 because our predication was so good. Not one of these defendants raised the defense of entrapment of the 103 that were charged.
Excellent.
One thing we didn't talk about was in April of 1980, I had been an FBI employee for approximately 2 months. And at that time, I wasn't out there roaming throughout the courts like we had intended because the Department of Justice was trying to decide exactly how to put all these contrived or phony cases into the system for me to fix. So I'm sitting at my apartment, and one day I receive a call from my best friend from the prosecutor's office, Mark Ciavelli. He got immunity, so I changed his name. And Mark says to me, hey, we haven't seen you out in the court system lately. Where have you been, at Quantico? I said, what do you mean? He said, well, Bob Silverman, who was reputed to be one of the most corrupt attorneys in the whole court system, Bob Silverman heard a rumor that you were working for the FBI, and we haven't seen you around lately. So that's why I asked. I said, hey, listen, I heard that same rumor, and it's not true. Let's meet in person, and I want to tell you why it isn't true. So he agreed to meet me at a restaurant about a week later, and I explained to him why this rumor wasn't true. And he said, well, Bob Silverman heard the rumor, and he's paranoid about it because Mark had told Bob Silverman the previous December, when I was undercover in the prosecutor's office, that I was a corrupt prosecutor and that I could be trusted. So Mark had paid me $100 to dismiss a narcotics case for Bob Silverman. And Mark had vouched for me. So Bob then, after the first payment through Mark, then paid me an additional 4 times to dismiss this narcotics cases.
And those were direct to you?
Those were direct from Bob to me. So 1 through Mark, and then 4 directly for Bob. So actually, both these guys were paranoid about this rumor that developed that I was working undercover for the FBI.
But it sounds like they continued to work with you anyway.
Well,
how'd that happen?
I have a theory about that. So when I met with Mark, I told him every reason in the world why it wasn't true. Well, he was more than willing to believe it wasn't true. Psychologically, he wanted to believe it wasn't true. Because, of course, if it was true, he was screwed. So he was more than happy to buy my reasoning. And same with Bob Silverman. Because if it was true I was an FBI agent, Bob was really screwed because he had bribed me 5 times. So that's why they continued to deal with me after that, Bob and my good friend from the prosecutor's office, Mark. Mark was by this time a criminal defense attorney.
And I guess in them cooperating with you or continuing to work with you, even though they thought this rumor was true, that kind of validated you with everybody else. But these 2 guys heard the same rumor and they're still working with him. Obviously, it's not true.
Exactly. I mean, Mark bought into it so much that day, Jerry, when I met with him in the restaurant, that the rumor was not true, that he even then volunteered to me during that conversation that he and his law partner were bribing a judge in another courthouse. They had a similar conspiracy like Costello and Olson did on the referrals, and that they were kicking back 25% of the cases that were referred to them by a judge named John Reynolds.
You know, the funny thing about this is that, I mean, you're good at this. You are good at convincing people that you're someone that you're not.
Well, thank you. I guess I'm a good actor. Even though I had absolutely no police, FBI, law enforcement training, I felt I was very, very good at this.
Did you still have the sweaty palms? Did you still have the heart palpitations as you told these stories, as you had to convince people that, you were not, working for the FBI?
Well, I would get nervous at times. For example, I confronted Bob Silverman a few months after he had heard the rumor. I didn't confront him, but I saw him in one of the courthouses, and I took the offensive. I went up to him and I said, Bob, Mark has told me you heard that rumor, and I want you to hear from my own mouth that rumor about me being an FBI agent is absolutely not true. And Bob says to me, this was another great recording, Terry, I knew from the moment I heard it that it wasn't true. Now, I was a little nervous there, I think, when I went up to Bob. So he was about to tell me where he thought he had heard the rumor, but I kind of stepped on his conversation and brought up something else, and I so wish I had let him just go on and on. But I was always nervous, too, when the first time I ever had to deal with someone. For example, if I was dealing with a Chicago police officer who was a bagman or a court clerk who was a bagman, I'd be very nervous the first time. I'd think, they can see the bulge under my suit where the recorder is or whatever. But then the second time, I'd be more relaxed about it. But it was kind of interesting, Jerry, along the lines of your question, that whenever I had to deal with a judge, even if it was the 3rd or 4th time, I was always very nervous when I had to deal with a judge. I never got over that.
Well, I guess, though, as an attorney, dealing with a judge, you were always, cautious and careful. So that kind of was accentuated when you're in this particular situation.
Right, exactly, that they're in a position of authority, even if it's in the normal course of being a lawyer. You need to be respectful and say the right thing. So, yes, it's along those lines.
You're thinking ahead of yourself, too, when they find out exactly, why you were talking to them and the fact that they were being recorded.
Right. And just on that note, too, you mentioned the future. So it was rather strange when I went to Mark's wedding a few months later, and I'm sitting in the church with my girlfriend, Kathy, and the priest is talking about what a great future Mark and his bride have. And I'm sitting there thinking, oh, my God, I know what's in it for his future, possible criminal indictment. So that was kind of strange.
Wow. You called him your best friend. So I think a lot of people are going to have the question about how could you do this to your best friend? What do you say about that?
Well, what happened was he and I go out to lunch. He was my best friend from the prosecutor's office. But around the same time I went undercover for the FBI, he quit the prosecutor's office and went into a private law practice. So a few months later, when I'm working undercover in Judge Olson's courtroom, he invites me out to lunch. And over lunch, he told me he had recently bribed a judge in another courtroom and that he had intended to fix another case in that courtroom. So I said to him, Mark, wouldn't it be better if everybody in the system just tried their cases on the evidence and let the chips fall where they may? His kind of cold response to that was, yeah, it would be, but this has been going on for too long in Cook County and it's never going to change. So I was just devastated by that, Jerry. I even went home and talked to my mom. I went to her home and talked to her and started crying when I told her about it because she knew how I was good friends with him. I think I felt that I'd lost my good friend to this sickness that was out there, this corruption. So I kind of resolved just to stay away from him. But then about 6 weeks after that, he calls me up at my apartment on a Monday evening, I think it was, and he says, hey, me and my law partner bought all these tickets to a closed-circuit television fight, the Sugar Ray Leonard, Roberto Duran fight. Would you like to go down to this theater and see it? And it was like, wow, that's a big fight. I do want to see that. I'm not much of a boxing fan, but it was a big sporting event. So we go down there, and on the way down there, he tells me how he recently had been co-counsel with a couple of defendants in another courthouse with Bob Silverman, who was reputed to be the most corrupt attorney in Cook County. And he told me how he and Bob had fixed this case out in this suburban courthouse. Then he tells me that he has a case coming up with me in my narcotics courtroom where Judge Olson is sitting. And he tells me that if I dismiss the case for him, the sun will shine for me. Well, I knew what he meant by that. Then he tells me that I didn't have to worry about what the two Chicago detectives thought who made the big arrest because he had bribed them. Then he tells me that he wants me to introduce him to Judge Olson because he wants to bribe Judge Olson on the case. So Olson will release $3,000 that have been seized as evidence. You know, so if anybody says to me, how could you do that to my friend? Well, what kind of friend was he that is trying to bribe me? He thinks I'm a real prosecutor in Cook County, like he had been. So he's trying to bribe me, a prosecutor, a law enforcement personage in Cook County, and make me a criminal? What kind of friend is that? That's what really kind of set me off when he tried to bribe me. And another thing that later that happened that makes me think he really wasn't my friend is that when we had this conversation about how paranoid Bob Silverman was about this rumor that I was undercover for the FBI, what he didn't tell me in that conversation was that Bob Silverman had also told him that if the rumor was true that I was working for the FBI, he was going to kill me. Mark didn't tell us that in April of 1981. We found out about it 2.5 years later when he cut a deal to get immunity from prosecution. And then he told the FBI 2.5 years later that Bob had threatened to kill me. So what kind of a friend is that?
Okay, well, I can understand why you were guilt-free on that area. Absolutely.
Guilt-free on doing him in, but I must tell you that psychologically it was a difficult thing to do. The most difficult thing I had to do, work against him. And it still bothers me a little bit to this day having had to do that. It was the right decision, but it wasn't an easy thing psychologically.
Wow. All right, so at what point does the FBI's investigation begin with all of these fixed cases for agents coming in throughout the country? When does that finally get initiated and on its way?
Well, we start putting cases into the system then in the spring of 1981. And I fixed my first 2 drunken driving cases in the summer of 1981. The going rate to fix a drunken driving case in Chicago Traffic Court was $200 for the judge, and then whatever you wanted to give the bagman for carrying the bribe. We found out that the system was set up where you were supposed to work with bagmen.
Mm-hmm.
So my first 2 fixes were drunken driving cases. I met my bagman, Harold Kahn, my first bagman, on these drunken driving cases. As a matter of fact, the judge on the first case is the one who introduced me to Harold. He was trying to insulate himself, but at the same time he told me that Harold was the guy I have to see. So I fixed my first 2 drunken driving cases, and then after that I fixed a shoplifting case through Harold, Kahn, the bagman, and then I met 2 police officers that I mentioned before, the Trunzo brothers, and I started paying them off to be my bagmen because I realized there's no sense in paying Harold more than 3 times. Let's move on to new targets. So through Harold, I met the Trunzo brothers, fixed shoplifting cases with them, battery cases, and they knew judges throughout the system because many judges in the system started out in traffic courts. So Harold, who worked there, and the Trunzos, they knew a lot of judges throughout the county. So then eventually I met a bagman named Jimmy Lefevre, and he was also a Chicago police officer who had worked in traffic court, and he was the best bagman in the world. He really got things done for me. I fixed 8 cases through Jimmy Lefevre, and he's the last person in the world we ever expected to cooperate when the investigation eventually ended. But he was one of the first ones through the door, and the reason we never expected him to cooperate was because he was the bagman for his first cousin, Judge Richard Lefevre.
Wow.
His first cousin, Richard, had been chief judge of traffic court, where he improved upon the system of corruption down there amongst all the judges he supervised. He then was transferred to the first municipal district of Cook County, where all the misdemeanor courtrooms were. It's the largest division in the Circuit Court of Cook County. He instituted a system of corruption there. And Jimmy was a Chicago police officer being paid by the Chicago Police Department, but he was the administrative assistant to the chief judge of the first municipal district, his first cousin. In other words, he was his cousin's bagman,
right,
paid by the police department. So I made it a point. I found out about him from another lawyer, and I started paying him off, and he and his cousin could fix cases anywhere for me in Cook County. His cousin knew all the judges in Cook County.
And Jimmy had no problem when this thing ended, testifying or agreeing to testify against his first cousin, the judge?
No, and what we found out was that his first cousin had pretty much told him, well, you have your own thing to worry about, I have my own thing to worry about, and he thought his cousin would keep his mouth shut. But one thing his cousin didn't realize was Jimmy had been a police officer for over 30 years, and he decided he wanted to save his police pension. If he was convicted of a felony, the federal government would seize his pension. But if he pled guilty to 3 misdemeanor tax counts, which he did, then he could save his police pension. So Jimmy pled guilty to 3 tax counts, misdemeanors, and he testified against his first cousin.
I would love to have been at that next Thanksgiving family dinner.
Right.
When after all of that went down.
Yeah, right.
Well, tell me a little bit more about some of the other people that you were able to capture in this case.
Well, one judge that I paid off in Chicago Traffic Court for drunken driving cases was Judge John Devine. And he was rumored to be one of the most corrupt judges in the system, like Olson. And he was known as Dollars Devine. That was his name. Everybody knew his name as Dollars Devine. That's how corrupt he was. So he ended up getting 15 years. He went to trial, and he ended up dying of cancer at the prison hospital in Springfield, Missouri. So he didn't serve his full 15 years. Eventually, we also got Lucius Robinson. Remember, he was the bailiff we talked about.
Right, sitting in the jury box.
Yeah,
right.
That used to supposedly sit in the jury box. Well, Lucius and his judge, Judge Maurice Pompey, by the time I was working undercover as a defense attorney, had been transferred to a major felony courtroom at 26th in California, the criminal courthouse. And so there they heard all types of felony cases, murders, rapes, armed robberies. So we staged a robbery, aggravated battery case where we had an FBI agent from L.A. pose as a defendant, and he supposedly robbed a woman agent from L.A. and pushed her down in a Kmart parking lot. So we had him arrested for robbery and aggravated battery. We arranged for the case to be assigned to Judge Pompey, and so I approached Lucius Robinson about fixing the case. And Lucius did his job as the bagman. He took $1,300 from me to fix this robbery case, but he never let me get near Judge Pompey. And so we fixed it for $1,300. After Greylord eventually ended, Lucius was indicted for taking the $1,300. But again, he did his job as a bagman. He never gave Pompey up. Interesting thing. So my name was revealed to the press as being one of the undercover FBI moles on December 6th of 1983. The very next day, December 7th of 1983, Judge Pompey announces he's retiring from the bench 1 day later. So he retires from the bench and moves to Arizona. Lucius gets 3 years for taking the $1,300 bribe from me. And then the U.S. Attorney's Office and the FBI developed additional evidence that Lucius was not just Pompey's bagman. He was a bagman for other judges in the criminal courthouse there at 26 in California. So they developed all sorts of other evidence against Lucius. So they decide, well, he's already gone off to prison for 3 years. Let's put him in the federal grand jury, give him immunity from prosecution, and have him talk about all of his other bad acts. So they put him in the grand jury, and he lies in the federal grand jury. So they indict him for perjury in the federal grand jury, and we have another trial against him, which concluded in 1992. Well, the first time he pled guilty. So we go to trial against Lucius in 92. I testify at the trial, and he's convicted of perjury. So he didn't want to go back to jail. He'd already done 3 years. So then he cooperates, and he gives us Judge Pompey when he cooperated. But it's 9 years after Pompey had retired. So he said that he had passed hundreds of bribes to Pompey. He couldn't remember how many, but we were never able to indict Judge Pompey. By this time, he'd been in
the statute of limitations?
Statute of limitations. He'd been in Arizona for 9 years.
Wow.
We did use Lucius on another trial where he testified against one of the other judges, Judge Tom Maloney. Lucius testified against him. That trial concluded in 1994 against Judge Maloney. And the interesting thing about Maloney is that he was the only judge we convicted of fixing murder cases in our 10 years on trial.
So altogether, how many defendants did you have?
Well, between our joint FBI, IRS investigation, we charged 103 individuals. 70 of those were indictments, over 70. And we were on trial for 10 years. The first indictments were in December of 83, and the last trial concluded I think in July of 94. So I testified for 10 years in federal court at the trials of 23 Greylord defendants over a 10-year period. When I started Greylord as a young prosecutor in 1980, I figured it would be over in 3 to 6 months. Here I was, 14 years later, just finishing up.
Wow. That is absolutely amazing. Now, when you were sworn in as an FBI agent, it sounds like it was just before you were going to go public with this case. Is that the case?
Well, when I was sworn in as an agent, it was 4 months before the case ultimately concluded for me. So I stayed undercover for another 4 months, made some recordings. Things were kind of winding down. There were leaks about the investigation by this time. So even though I was undercover for another 4 months, I wasn't able to fix a case during that time because of the leaks. But I did make a few recordings and started preparing for the indictments, listening to a lot of tape recordings. And then finally, my name leaked to the press on December 6th of 1983 while I was back at FBI headquarters working on improving some of the tape recordings, suppressing some of the noises in the background, that kind of thing.
All right. So, of course, my question to you is, why in February of 1988 you resigned as a special agent? What made you decide to do that?
Well, what happened to me was when I entered into the service of the FBI as an agent, the rule at that time was coming out of Quantico, you were transferred to a small to medium-sized office for 2 to 4 years, and then you went on to a big 12 office.
Absolutely. I was under that program.
Okay, well, you know it very well then. So everybody in my class went to Louisville, Kentucky, or I'm trying to think what were the small offices in those. Seattle was not considered a major office in those days.
I went to Sacramento. That's during the
Sacramento, yeah.
Yeah, I came in 1982, so I went to Sacramento.
Right. And how long did you stay in Sacramento? 2 to...
About a year and a half.
Okay. So, well, I was facing all these Greylord trials when I graduated from Quantico. So they decided that, well, it didn't make any sense to transfer me to Sacramento or wherever. They decided to send me back to Chicago on a temporary basis to testify at these Greylord trials. And we were probably thinking, well, they'll last a couple of years, and then I'd be on to my small and medium-sized office. So every 90 days, I had to send a teletype into the FBI transfer unit in D.C. justifying why I needed to stay in Chicago. So we sent that teletype in every 90 days for about the next 5 years. And then Greylord had looked like in about 87, 88 it was winding down. So my case agent, he was now the supervisor, Bill McGarry, who retired as SAC of Newark. Bill says to me, hey, I'm being transferred back to headquarters. It might be a good time for us to put you in for transfer, and maybe we'll get you to go somewhere where you might want to go. So I said, sure. So an agent, because an agent who sat across from me, something similar had happened to him because of his work on Greylord. He was just a case agent, and he had been able to get Milwaukee. So FBI headquarters gets back a couple weeks later and said, you know what? You've been in Chicago for 5 years. Why don't you just stay in Chicago? I said, sure. So then about a week after that, through the inter-office bureau mail, I received an envelope saying that I'd been transferred to a Big 12 office. And
Chicago?
No. You have one more guess, Jerry.
New York.
Philadelphia.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I was transferred to Philadelphia. And
I don't remember seeing you there, and I was there in 1984 until 2008. So what's the deal?
I never made it there. So I've transferred to Philadelphia, and by this time I was married to my wife, Kathy, and we had 2 girls, Christine and Elizabeth, and so our situation had changed. And by this time also, Kathy had become an assistant state's attorney. She'd been a prosecutor for about almost 3 years, and she loved her job as a prosecutor in Cook County. So that's the reason I left the Bureau. It wasn't Philadelphia. It was because I just didn't want to take Kathy away from her career and the career she loved. I had tremendous guilt feelings about doing that.
I have to say, I love the FBI, and I am always positive about the FBI. But I have to say that the end of this story about, them not being able to leave you in Chicago is absolutely ridiculous.
Well, it is.
I cannot understand why a man who put his life on the line, put his reputation, his career on the line, they couldn't make an exception which they do all the time and just leave you in Chicago.
Exactly.
It is mind-blowing.
98% of what happened to me regarding the FBI was positive. That was probably the only negative. But at the same time, Jerry, I was too honorable to try and arrange to change things.
There you go again with that integrity.
Yeah, I was tired of the case fixing in the courts, and I wasn't going to fix my transfer. Because people like yourself, I'm sure you weren't from Sacramento, and you were transferred there.
I'm from Virginia. Yeah.
Yeah. So, there were other people in the office. Most of the people in the office were in that boat, where they were in Chicago somewhere other than their home. And I didn't want to disrespect those people, so I kept my mouth shut and decided the only thing to do was to find a new job.
So what did you end up doing? Because in this new job, you were still going to have to be gone for long periods of time in order to testify in these other Operation Greylord trials.
Yes, good point. As it turned out, I testified at more trials after I left the FBI than when I was an FBI agent. But I saw from reading your bio that you worked for SEPTA after you left the Bureau. So when I left the Bureau, I went to work for the SEPTA equivalent in Chicago, the Regional Transportation Authority.
Okay, yes, I know them well.
Yeah, as the Inspector General. They were very gracious about letting me go to testify. So I spent a lot of time over at the Federal Building while I was working for the RTA.
Right, because it's not just the time taken actual testifying in court, but all the trial prep that you have to do in preparation for that. Exactly.
And I do remember spending a lot of weekends in the U.S. Attorney's Office on my own time.
So how many times would you say you actually testified?
23.
23 times. Yeah. And that must have been really grueling.
It generally was. The cross-examination was extremely difficult because the defense attorneys would cross you about you helped introduce these phony cases into the system. You allowed your undercover FBI agent to testify falsely in court and that kind of thing. So you lied in court when you presented these cases. Aren't you lying on the witness stand now? You're a rat. You did in your best friend for the prosecutor's office. All that kind of thing. They rarely wanted to talk about the evidence of the judge's corruption or the lawyer's corruption. They just wanted to dirty me up to the best of their ability. I stayed with the Regional Transportation Authority for 5.5 years, but then I decided I really wanted to return to the federal government. So I went back as an agent at the Railroad Retirement Board, Inspector General's office. I stayed there for 3.5 years, and then I transferred to the Department of Justice Office of Inspector General and stayed there about 12 years. And then when I turned 57 in 2008, I had to mandatorily retire. That's the mandatory retirement age in federal law enforcement. And I retired from the Department of Justice Inspector General's office in 2008. After that, I went to work for the Cook County Sheriff's Office, and eventually I returned to the Cook County State's Attorney's Office. So I came full circle. I went back to the State's Attorney's Office as a prosecutor. But to promote my book, I retired from there on December 31st of 2015. So I've been retired for about 6 months now, and I must say I'm enjoying it.
Well, this has been absolutely fascinating. So tell us about the book. You wrote a book about all of this, didn't you?
Yes. In August, I came out with a book called Operation Greylord, the story of an untrained undercover agent. And it was published by the American Bar Association. They have an imprint called Anchorwick, and it's available on Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, Target.com. And it's been doing fairly well. We're pretty pleased with the results. And we're negotiating with some producers, directors in Hollywood, so to speak, to perhaps get the book made into a movie.
I'm going to put a link to that book on the show notes. Do you have your own website?
I do. Terry, Terry, Hake, Hake.com.
Very good. That way people will know how to get in touch with you. All right. So we're just about done here. Is there any closing words or anything that you want to say that we haven't had a chance to talk about?
No, Jerry. I think we've covered a lot of bases over the last two sessions here. And it's been an honor to speak with you on your podcast.
Why, thank you very much. And that's the end of the interview. I really enjoyed speaking with Terry. He's a great guy. If you enjoyed this interview as much as I did, I would encourage you to share it with your friends and family. Share it on social media and let people know. As always, back at jerrywilliams.com, you'll find photos of Terry. There are links to newspaper articles about Operation Greylord and a TV show where they talk not only to Terry, but to the U.S. Attorney at the time, other people working in the court system, journalists who had played a role or had a part in Operation Greylord. There is also a link to Terry's book, Operation Greylord, the true story of an untrained undercover agent and America's biggest corruption bust. I had mentioned in the intro that Thriller Fest was for authors. There is also a Fan Fest portion of this conference where fans who love mysteries and thrillers and crime fiction come to meet their favorite authors. There are lots of panel discussions. It's just a fabulous conference. And so if you love crime fiction, mysteries, thrillers, then even if you have no intention of writing a book, you might want to check it out next year. The conference is always in New York and always the first or second week of July. I will have more information in my next newsletter. And so if you're interested and you haven't signed up yet, if you go to my website, you can do that. I'm having a great time meeting so many wonderful listeners. I want to say to Ben, good luck on your FBI special agent interview. I'm rooting for you. Keep me posted on how things go. For those who were following along last week, I did finish reading The Silkworm by Robert Galbraith, a.k.a. J.K. Rowling of Harry Potter fame. It was an interesting read. I looked it up on Amazon and was surprised to see that it got 4 out of 5 stars. But what do I know? This episode was sponsored by FBIRetired.com, the only online directory made available to the general public featuring retired FBI agents and analysts interested in showcasing their skills to secure business opportunities. I want to thank you for listening, and I hope you come back again next week for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.